Our 4th anniversary was approaching, and something had changed in the previous few months. Gwen was recently promoted to project manager, thus the shift coincided with that. When her boss went on vacation due to a heart attack, she took over an essential project. The pressure was increasing, and Gwen's OCD, which was often barely controlled, kicked into high gear. Gwen's time spent in the workplace increased exponentially, while our time together reduced proportionally. At first, Gwen appeared to appreciate the small things I did to reduce stress, rubbing my feet, keeping the home clean, and doing the laundry. Then, around 6 weeks after her promotion, nothing mattered. My touch was unwanted. My comments, intended to encourage and assist her, were disregarded. I was living with a stranger and was completely desperate. After speaking with friends who had been married for a long time, particularly those who knew Gwen and I as a loving pair, they were all astonished by my nervousness. Paul, my buddy, made a less normal comment. I find this difficult to believe. Every partnership experiences a lull, but you and Gwen have only been married for 4 years. This should not happen after 3 or more years. Are you certain you weren't imagining things? When I told Paul that Gwen and I hadn't had love in over 3 weeks, he was startled when I mentioned some of Gwen's recent statements. He went from surprise to wonder, then into lover mode. Perhaps she left you. I don't see how or when she works so hard in the office. She has been charged with overseeing the transfer to the new platform. The AZ project is in her lap. It's a career shift, and Gwen is too focused on her profession to squander her opportunity by running away to some love haven. So I guess that's the way it is, buddy. Your wife is working on a project that is absorbing her time, and you are collateral damage. I considered it, but something doesn't seem right here. Paul peered to the bottom of his beer glass. I knew Paul well enough to read his thoughts. He considered whether he should have another drink or go home to his wife and children. I noticed a faint smile spread across his face as he made his selection and instructed the bartender to close it. Paul adores his family. After paying the bill, he gave me one more bit of advice. Let me say one thing less. You shouldn't blame Gwen for anything, especially if all she did was labor long hours under tough situations to complete this project. There is nothing worse than having an unsupportive husband. Do not be that man. The stranger on the other side of me must have heard Paul's final comment. I could scarcely understand what the guy said to the side. There is nothing worse than an unsupportive husband, except a dishonest spouse. I resolved to try my best to believe, but check. For example, the next Saturday, when Gwen had to spend the day in the office installing new equipment, I called her mid-afternoon and asked if I might bring pizza for lunch. Gwen's response was, "Less. That would be very lovely of you, but could you have 3 large pizzas? There are 4 of us here and we are all hungry." I collected their pizza orders and headed down to her workplace to deliver them. Gwen introduced me to 2 guys I had not met before. I already knew Janice from the previous holiday party, and 2 of the guys, Brad and Clark, were new employees. The 5 of us sat and ate pizza. The discussion was friendly, however Brad was notably quieter, something I was used to when talking with computer people without revealing anything. I did my best to monitor Gwen's time away from home. She undoubtedly dedicated all of her time to this undertaking, and I never saw her leave the house. 3 weeks later, I was sitting at home waiting for Gwen. I hadn't detected any signs of Gwen's negative behavior, but we hadn't reconnected emotionally or physically. I decided on a different approach. Dinner was on the stove. The bottle of Merlot was breathing. The table was set with candles lit and a little vase of irises. When Gwen went through the door, it was 7:30. Gwen glanced at the table, stunned for a time, then grinned, kissed me, and finally removed her coat and shoes. "That's quite sweet." I poured her a drink of wine, cleaned up, and changed. "Dinner will be served in 10 minutes. Then we should talk." When Gwen came downstairs, she glanced at me and the wheels turned. Dinner was provided. Medallions with roasted potatoes and asparagus. When we finished our last mouthful, we talked about our day. Gwen leaned back in her seat, unwilling to wait any longer. "What is this, Les?" I took out an envelope and opened it. "Gwen, I understand how difficult the past 5 months have been for you, and I understand your conversion date is in 2 weeks on Saturday. I believe we should spend some time together after your conversion, considering that you will want to be close to us for at least 2 weeks. I've scheduled a week-long trip for us. This starts in a month. We have 24 hours to answer yes or no, and if I do not cancel by 4 o'clock tomorrow, we will forfeit 25% of our prepayment. I showed Gwen a brochure for a resort in the Caribbean. We are traveling first class to the Dominican Republic. The resort is all-inclusive for couples. I leaned back in my chair and observed Gwen, who alternated between staring at me and leafing through the brochure. After a long pause, she spoke. There were tears in her eyes. "The forest is lovely. I would love to go on a trip with you. The time is great. Everything should be ready by the time we depart. Thank you for that." The next 4 weeks went on indefinitely. Gwen's project was ready. The conversion had gone smoothly, with just minor hitches that could be quickly addressed. I parked my car in a faraway lot, and we took the shuttle to the terminal, about our luggage. We had only 2 modest suitcases, my backpack and her handbag. I planned to spend the entire week wearing only shorts, a polo shirt, and a swimsuit. Gwen had 3 sundresses, 2 pairs of shorts, and a carry-on. We picked up our boarding credentials and are waiting in line to go through first-class security. A familiar face approached us. Gwen appeared astonished and probably spoke louder than she wanted. "Brad, what are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you." "Gwen, I was upset because I assumed it was a job issue. Can't this wait till Gwen returns from vacation?" Brad ignored me. "Gwen, we need to chat now." I began to speak again, but Gwen interrupted me. She appeared upset but less concerned. "Please continue. I'll handle this and I'll be right with you. This will only take a few minutes." I paused. Gwen repeated, "Please, let's continue. I will be right there." She turned to Brad, enraged. I concluded that staying here would simply delay the moment she had to say something. I checked my watch and proceeded through security. When I arrived at the gate, the plane was already boarding. I needed a beverage. I knew where to find one, and I committed the second biggest mistake of my life. When the flight attendant reached me, I had already walked through the first-class passenger lane, given my boarding card, went down the aisle, and sat down. I didn't even give her an opportunity to speak. "Hi, can I get a double bourbon that isn't carbonated?" I must have phrased it sweetly, as the girl returned with my drink, less than 30 seconds later. I thanked her before taking a deep sip, and the liquid warmed my throat, permeating my brain and quickly calming my heart. The last passengers were boarding. I took out my phone to call Gwen. There was no response. The call went to voicemail. I composed a message. "Where are you now?" Nothing. I sent a second mail. "You are out of time. Where are you now?" I was so focused on my phone that I didn't notice the cockpit door close. My body detected the movement of the plane. We were simultaneously moving away from the gate. A text message arrived on my phone. It was from Gwen, and it said, "I apologize." The flight attendant stood next to me. "Sir, you'll have to turn your phone off." Her voice jolted me out of my trance. "Can I get off? It is an emergency." "What type of emergency?" "My wife. She didn't make her flight. I suspect she abandoned me." "I am deeply sorry, sir. We cannot return to the gate on this occasion. Think about the other passengers, please. They are affected by any delay." The look on my face must have conveyed my impotence, as she handed me a little bottle of bourbon before beginning the safety briefing. After 5 hard hours in the air, the jet landed at Punta Cana Airport. As soon as I was cleared, I dialed Gwen's phone. Of course, she did not respond. Why should she? As I hung up, I noted a missed call from her and received a voicemail message. It seemed like she was crying, and I had to try twice to comprehend it. "I apologize, but the letter I wrote you will clarify everything. I'm sorry I picked the coward's way. You deserve better." That was it. I signed into my email from my phone. There was a message from Gwen. The airplane was preparing to land. What an awful moment. I stepped off the plane, sat down as quickly as possible, and read Gwen's email. "I apologize. I thought I could get away from you and start over. I've been having an affair with Brad for the past 4 months until you startled me with the suggestion that we leave together." Gwen had written 1 entire page, alternating between apologies, excuses, and explanations. Of what, why, with whom, and how long? I sat reading the note and tried to remain calm. I was probably not very good at it when I finally got up and went through customs. Something about my appearance must have triggered the customs agent's memory. Before I knew it, I was in a small room with my bags and 2 agents. Fortunately, one of the agents understood English fluently, and I persuaded him to read my wife's Dear John letter to understand why I looked like a lost soul. Is there a worse sight than a sad simpleton who has just been revealed as a cuckold? The expressions on my face were terrible, but I tried not to cry, attempting to keep my composure. I was discharged within an hour. I walked in around dusk and took the shuttle to the resort. It was around 8 p.m. I needed a drink and went to bed. The beating continued as I attempted to check into my hotel. The girl asked, "Where's your wife?" "My wife could not make it. I am deeply sorry, sir. This is a couples resort, and I cannot let you check in without your wife. I paid $5,000 for a week. I need a room. Couldn't you make an exception?" She could not. I asked for the manager. The night manager approached the desk and explained the rules to me, reminding me that the reservation specifically stated that single rooms were not permitted under any circumstances. When I asked where I could stay that night, he gladly recommended another resort down the beach that had room available. He even had a bellman drive me to the resort. When I went to check into the second resort, my credit card was denied. I brought out the second card I had with me in case it was denied again. I tried calling Gwen to figure out why our cards weren't working. No response. I called both banks' hotlines and was informed that the cards had been deactivated. I sent Gwen a text message. "Why did you cancel the cards?" 10 minutes later, I received her response. "Brad recommended canceling the cards. He claimed you wouldn't need them because the resort was prepaid and all-inclusive." Reading her remark, I believe I surprised the hotel clerk with a string of 4-letter and other swear words. Fortunately, my one good fortune that day was that I had over $600 in cash on me. I paid for the night in cash and had little more than half of it left. I strolled into my room, which was probably the worst $300 a night hotel I'd ever had the misfortune of staying in, and sat down for a moment to collect my thoughts. I could not access my bank accounts. I'd have to contact the bank in the morning just in case. I called my brother in Denver after describing the scenario, assuring him and his wife that I wasn't pulling a joke on them. No, not Gwen and that bitch from both sides. I was finally able to reach the bank. I was finally able to address the root of my pressing issue. My brother agreed to go to his bank first thing in the morning and send a few thousand to the closest Western Union. I then phoned the airline. My ticket was non-transferable. My fault for selecting the cheapest choice. This signifies that the tickets were not covered. I discovered that if I paid cash for return tickets, I would have to purchase them in person at the airport. On Tuesday night, the first accessible flight from Punta Cana was a red-eye. I sat down to read Gwen's letter a second and last time. "I apologize. I thought I could get away from you and start over. For the past 4 months, until you startled me with the suggestion of leaving together, I'd been having an affair with Brad. I was not going to cheat on you. As the project progressed, I spent increasingly less time with you and more time with Brad. I started to rely on him for emotional support. No, it was not intended to happen, but it occurred. After his first kiss, I resisted for weeks. But, after a long Saturday at work and the rest of the team had left, I succumbed to his solicitations and became an adulteress. I continued wondering why you didn't notice me sliding away from you, which led me to Brad. It is only now, as I sit here writing this letter, that I realize how many times you asked me what was bothering me and what you could do to assist. But it's too late to appreciate everything you've done for our marriage, even booking a week at a resort. You told me about the week we spent together rebuilding our connection. It was as if you opened my eyes. In that instant, I realized I wanted to marry you. The very next day, I informed Brad that it was over. It was difficult for him to accept. Every day, he tried to reignite our affair, and for the most part, I declined his advances. Yes, I am weak. I was weak when I succumbed to his lure and began an affair. I was weak when he persuaded me to say goodbye one more time over the last few weeks. And I was weak when Brad arrived at the airport and persuaded me to forego our trip and our week together. I hope you can take some time this week to forget about us. Brad informed me that if it were up to him, he would spend a week at a resort in paradise with wonderful cuisine, plenty of beverages, sunshine, and time off work, which is precisely how he would like it to finish. I hope this is also true for you. I almost left him and boarded the plane. But Brad said you had to have found out about the affair when he arrived at the airport. And you probably don't want to be around me after that. It made sense. And I had no idea how difficult it would be to spend 5 hours sitting next to you, sensing your contempt. I also need this week to reflect on what I've done. I'll try to return your call when you return next Sunday. By then, my clothing and everything else should have left our house. Please do not hate me. I realize I've done too much to be your loving wife after this, but I can't face your hatred with regret. Gwen. I considered deleting the letter, but ultimately opted to keep it. At the very least, it answered one question. Gwen was undoubtedly having fun in the office with that jackass, which is why I never saw her outside. The bar would remain open for the following hour, just enough time to go downstairs, get a drink, and toast. To my horror, my wife's infidelity led to the demise of our marriage while I was growing up. My father made certain that all 3 of his children understood his message about alcohol and drunkenness. I heard it before my final year of high school, and again on the morning I turned 21. Less drinking has never resolved issues. Even worse, there are 3 types of nasty drunks. They're the crybaby, the angry asshole, and the laughing hyena. Do not be any of them. Drink gently and quietly, enjoy the high, but know your limits. And if I ever discover you're drinking and driving, I do not care how old you are. I'm going to take away your automobile and beat you. The trouble was, Dad didn't drink tea. He could drink a beer just like anyone else, but I never saw my father get drunk, act idiotic, or drive after more than 1 beer. He followed his own rules, so I knew I'd leave the bar after 2 beers, but before I returned to my room, I'd like to enjoy both. After drinking my first president, I gazed around the bar. There were 2 single men, 4 couples, including 2 guys who I presumed were a pair, and a 5th couple attempting to seduce each other on the dance floor. The bartender was watching me in the jumper, and when our gazes crossed, we laughed. The guy on the dance floor must have weighed over 60 pounds, while the lady resembled olive oil. You young people can look her up online. I almost said something to the bartender. At least his wife did not abandon him at the dang airport. It made me wonder, how did I screw up? Had I truly screwed up? Had our entire 5-year relationship, including 4 years of marriage, been an illusion? I did not think so. Until a few months ago, it appeared that Gwen and I were very much in love. We're happy. That made me think as I drank my 2 beers. We first met 5 years ago at a baseball game for the Chiefs, Peoria's minor league franchise. Gwen was with a group of females and wore a Ryne Sandberg jersey. Although the Chiefs are associated with the St. Louis Cardinals, there are many Cubs supporters in this area of Illinois. I sat down next to them and quickly tried to approach a tall blonde with a nice face and long legs. To introduce myself, I bought all 4 of them a beer, and then utilized her tank top to start a conversation. You look a little young to be wearing Sandberg's jersey. He was slightly ahead of his time, wasn't he? Ryne Sandberg was Dad's favorite player. He purchased it for me. I introduced myself by extending my hand. I am Thomas Lester. Everyone calls me Les. She seized my hand. Gwen Harper. Everyone calls me Gwen. She informed me that she was a senior at Bradley University, studying in information technology. I told her I'd been out of college for 2 years and was working in Caterpillar's engineering department. We somehow returned to the subject of Sandberg jerseys. Dad described his marriage to Mom as one of the 5 finest days of his life, the day I was born. The day my brother Pete was born. The Cubs drafted him on the same day that Ryne Sandberg hit 2 home runs off Bruce Sutter. Your father played for the Cubs, never made the big leagues, but spent 2 years in Iowa Triple-A, which is still quite excellent. Gwen and I talked for the rest of the game until she left with her pals. She gave me her phone number and said I should call. I called the following day. We started dating that weekend, which marked the beginning of our romance. It took a few months, but I finally got Gwen into my bed. She was not only attractive, but she enjoyed sports and was really capable. She graduated summa cum laude. We had one issue that could have been critical or decisive. Her friends, notably her father, were quite competitive about their sports teams. My alma mater, Purdue, competed in men's basketball with Bradley. We were all at the pub watching the game. I enjoy it when Purdue wins, but I am not on the team and cannot influence whether they win or lose. But that night, every time Bradley scored, one of Gwen's male pals would get in my face and salute the other guys at the table. Fortunately, Bradley won. I was informed I needed to buy the following round. I clenched my teeth, refused to back down, and stayed firm in my belief that the winner would buy. Nothing came of it, but I'm very certain I didn't score a single point that night with Gwen's friends. Gwen felt at ease with the situation and said nothing. Even if I averted that bullet, it did not prepare me for meeting her father. Thanksgiving arrived. Gwen and I had been dating seriously for 4 months, and it was time to meet their parents. I walked into their Arlington Heights house and was immediately greeted by Mom and Dad, who praised Gwen's intelligence. She may make mistakes from time to time, and this was one of those moments just after she introduced us. Gwen quipped, "Watch out, Dad. He is a Cardinals fan." Was that simply a frown on the old man's face? It took 5 years for the Cubs to reach and win the World Series, and in the preceding 10 years, the Cardinals had been there 3 times, winning twice. So I completely get how this might be a painful point for a Cubs fan, particularly someone who has played in their development system. I needed points with my girlfriend's family, so I minimized my fandom. At least that is what I attempted to achieve. First strike. I was a Cardinals fan, albeit, as I've already stated, I'm not a big fan of my own teams. For the following 5 years, until that day at the airport, I felt as if I was on probation. My father was only waiting for the next strike. Let me just add that this dad was an asshole. I hope he is pleased with how things worked out in the end. Of course, more about that later. Gwen and I returned to Peoria following Thanksgiving, and everything was back to usual. Gwen was about to graduate high school and already worked at State Farm in Bloomington. I called. Mr. Harper requested his daughter's hand in marriage and purchased a ring 2 days before Christmas. I presented Gwen to my family. They liked her, and on Christmas Eve I proposed. Gwen cried and said yes, and we began making preparations to marry at the end of July, exactly 1 year after that day in Dozer Park. We did not start living together. Gwen left her apartment with the 2 other girls she shared it with, but Gwen stayed with me 4 or 5 evenings a week. It was really dumb. However, her family opposed premarital cohabitation. We found a little farmhouse to rent near Peoria, where I worked, and Bloomington, where Gwen worked, and relocated there after our honeymoon. We married on July 30th and spent our honeymoon on Miami Beach. That was until 4 months ago when everything went wrong, and I found myself alone, thousands of miles from home, drinking Dominican beer. The bartender rang the bell to make the final call. I concluded my second president and thanked him for providing a nice location for me to think things through. I gave him a big tip and returned to my room late Monday morning after calling our bank and discovering that all 3 of our accounts had been closed. I was at the Western Union office collecting up the money that my brother had sent. I took a cab to the airport and purchased a ticket for Tuesday's trip, ensuring that nothing was released before. It was mid-afternoon when I returned to the resort and extended my stay until the next day. What happens now? I did not feel like starting to drink, so I threw on my swim trunks and went for a run on the beach, followed by a relaxing swim in the warm sea. I returned to my room immediately afterward. Nothing irritates a guy who was dumped less than 30 hours ago. Imagine seeing dozens of couples in loving embraces. I got room service so I wouldn't have to watch the same thing while dining. I spent the next 5 hours reading and nearly finished the Vince Flynn paperback I purchased at the Hotel Boutique on Tuesday. Another long-run swim discharge, followed by lunch in town. A visit to the airport, 7 hours of reading, another spy novel, boarding the airplane. I tried and failed to fall asleep on the plane. It's a 2.5-hour drive to our residence, and here I am at home, standing and staring at the empty bed. The majority of Gwen's clothing and personal items were already gone. I awoke at midday on Wednesday after collapsing on the bed. I contacted my pal at his office to get the lawyer's name. After contacting Henry Abbott's office, I scheduled an appointment for Thursday afternoon. "Mr. Abbott, please call me." Henry had a businesslike demeanor. He wasn't going to be my best friend, but he assured me that he would do a fantastic job representing and defending me. He listened to my narrative and said he'd have the docs available for review on Monday if I could give all of the required information by Friday afternoon. I left with a long list of critical information and chores that had to be done by Friday afternoon. Henry was quite systematic. He had me write down everything that happened from the minute Brad met us at the airport until the time I was handed the documents, underlining that I was left in a foreign country with no means of support, as well as a full list of our belongings. All of the money I had spent in D.C. and to get off the island, as well as all of our communal goods, were vanished when I returned home. My rush to have everything processed turned out to be ineffective. On Monday morning, as I waited at work for a call from Abbott's office informing me that the paperwork was ready for my signature, a receptionist entered my office. "There is a gentleman here to see you, but he won't tell me what he needs." "It's okay, Sarah. I will go over there. Henry warned me that Gwen may serve me first. He persuaded me it would be better that way. That way we'll understand what they're thinking. Furthermore, you will assume the position of the aggrieved party. She is ending the marriage, not you. It sounds logical from a legal sense, but getting the documents is nevertheless unpleasant. When I read the newspaper, I became really angry and nearly called Gwen to shout at her. Fortunately, my brain turned on, and I evaded the trap. One of my acquaintances informed me that his wife's lawyer had baited him in this way. My friend called his separated wife and began ranting at her. The next thing he knew, a no-contact court order was issued at the court hearing, providing additional evidence of his violent actions. I presented the documents to my attorney, and as they say, the games began. 2 months after receiving the paperwork, when the judge entered the courtroom, my attorney and I were sitting there waiting for him. I nearly lost my senses. Of course, there had to be a female judge. I'd heard awful stories about justice, intimidating men in divorce court. I prepared myself for the worst. Gwen's attorney made a set of demands. Gwen didn't even glance at me as her attorney handled the negotiations. I observed that jackass Brad was not in the courtroom. A wise decision on their part. My lawyer outlined our version of events. The judge was well aware of all of this. Everything had been provided and discussed beforehand. Her attorney had an opportunity to respond. Then, our final rebuttal. The court asked Gwen a question, using her maiden name exactly as her counsel had. "Miss Harper, you make no claims of violence against Mr. Lester. Did you simply fall in love with Mr. Bradley Parker and decide to leave your husband because you loved another man?" Gwen and her attorney paused for a while before she said, "Yes, Your Honor." "There was no violence. Thank you for your honest response. If there is one thing I would not accept in my courtroom, it is people making false allegations of abuse to get an advantage." The judge paused briefly to reread her notes. "The court grants a divorce, which becomes effective immediately. No alimony will be awarded. Each party will maintain their own retirement assets and personal possessions. The jointly acquired property will be shared 50/50ths between Miss Harper gets half. She will reimburse Mr. Lester for his portion of the wrecked holiday, which cost $9,000 in total. All cash spent throughout his stay, including return flights. Ms. Harper will pay both parties' attorney fees and $3,200 to cover half of the couple's rent for 7 months, the time between when she left and when the lease on their rental house expired." The judge took a hard look at Gwen. "You, young lady, stated that you loved your husband. If that is how you treat the person you love, God help the one you do not love. You could have knocked me down with a feather out of 20,000, half of Gwen's. Let's use our savings to buy a house." She had to give me nearly $16,000 as the lawyer and I were leaving the courtroom. Gwen heard a plea for less behind her. As I walked out of the courtroom, I noticed Brad seated on the bench. He tried to get up from the bench, but I was already in his face. "You know she'll cheat on you too." I walked away. Outside the courthouse, I asked Henry if I might buy him lunch. We entered the diner across the street. When I saw that the judge was a woman, I nearly peed myself. I was sure I was going to get screwed. That's when you go wrong. For 2 reasons. It's always a grandfather judge who looks at a beautiful wife and grants her the farm. We could not have chosen a greater judge than Judy Carter. You knew we were entering her courtroom. Why haven't you told me? I didn't want you to be under any misconceptions or grow too confident in case she questioned you. Henry proceeded. Judge Carter has been married to the same man for 40 years and adores him to bits. She's a reputable attorney. He works as a machinist in a local machine company that supplies Caterpillar parts. But it's a marriage of equals. Barry Carter is a fantastic person. Despite having 5 strokes and winning every freaking tournament, he remains unassuming at the club. Henry paused, talking to take a sip of coffee. Let me tell you one final anecdote. Just because you was bitten the first time you walked down the wedding aisle, but you should realize that there are wonderful girls in the world. At a country club dance, the judge also serves as a barrier. They are sitting at the same table as my wife, me and another couple. One of the local bigwigs, owner of a car dealership in town, walks up, ignores Barry, and asks Judge to dance. Barry isn't cocky, but he's also man enough to let his wife handle it. Judy tears the guy apart. "Has anyone ever taught you good manners?" she asks. "No gentleman would ask a lady to dance without first asking for her escort. Now go away and pray. You'll never be in my courtroom. And if you are, you'd better tell your lawyer you need another judge because I can't promise you a fair hearing." The judge leaned over and kissed her husband. She knows that some people underestimate her husband just because he works with his hands. I laughed at the story only half an hour in Judge Carter's courtroom, and I was already imagining the experience. You're different from most lawyers. I'm sorry if it sounds like I'm judging your profession, but now it was Henry's turn to laugh. My father worked on an assembly line at CAT for over 30 years, and my mother stayed home and raised 5 children. The day I was accepted to law school, my dad hugged me, congratulated me, and said, "Don't become an asshole." We finished lunch. I thanked him again, and we went our separate ways. Time to start a new life. Well-meaning co-workers and other acquaintances would set me up on dates or make recommendations for women. They thought I should meet to get over my broken heart. The problem with all of these setups was this. I didn't need a new relationship, yet it was still too raw. I mostly hung out at local bars with a reputation for being a regular. I had enough free time to take dance lessons, but there's always danger in being a Lothario. One night I spent an hour having a great time with one particularly well-built girl. We were on our way out when her left hand lit up and there was an unmistakable lightness on her 4th finger, evidence of a recently removed ring. "Are you married?" She looked up at me like a deer in headlights and stammered out the words. "Yes, but my husband is away. Where is he?" "In Afghanistan. He's in the army. You should be ashamed of yourself. Your husband risks his life and you want to cheat on him." She started to cry, then collapsed on the sidewalk. I'm so sorry. I'm such a slut." I picked her up off the sidewalk. She looked me in the eye and started talking some bullshit. "He's been gone for 5 months and I worry every day. I got lonely and there were a few guys hitting on me at work. I didn't want to cheat with a guy I never have to see again. So tonight I went on a date. It was the first time, I swear. I needed to feel like a woman. I'm such a slut." I looked across the street at the late-night diner. "Let's go get a cup of coffee. Put your ring on and let's go." I handed her the clean handkerchief I always carry with me. "Here, wipe your tears before we go in." Kelly and I sat in the diner for the next hour, and she told me all about Sergeant John Tyler. She told me about the 2 assholes in her office, including her supervisor, who were trying to get her to come to work. Their constant harassment was getting to her. I convinced Kelly to talk to HR. I drove Kelly to her house. We agreed to have lunch the following Saturday. I wanted to follow up with her, let her know that she needed to get rid of the 2 bullying behaviors, and I was going to make sure she did. About once every 3 weeks, we would meet for coffee and a sandwich. We would just talk. Kelly told me that eventually the company transferred her to another department and reprimanded the 2 men. She walked into the coffee shop one day and the joy on her face was obvious to anyone who looked. "John is coming home in 2 weeks. I congratulated her, told her I was happy for her, and thought it was our last lunch. She seemed saddened by this, but understood. "Thanks for being my friend, Les. You helped me deal with those 2 cretins at work and realize how I could have lost the best thing in the world. John's love. You were there for me when I needed a true friend. I'll never forget that. I will miss her." But as I walked out of the restaurant, I felt good. I walked out of my office building and a 6'3" man dressed in a desert uniform stood in front of me. I recognized him from the pictures Kelly had once shared with me. "Are you Thomas Lester?" I didn't extend my hand, deciding to let him set the pace for the next steps. "Is it okay if we go somewhere to talk? There's a bar 4 blocks south of here. I can meet you there, okay?" We got into our cars. He followed me inside. I bought my first drink. Kelly told me what happened. "I wanted to look you in the eye and hear it from you. I've got to tell you it's total bullshit to come home and hear your wife admit she went on a date." Well, it didn't happen. At least not with me. And I highly doubt with anyone else. She had a moment of weakness. She loves you. So why didn't you take advantage of it? My ex-wife left me. It hurt like hell. I couldn't do that to another guy, especially a man in uniform. Did you ever serve? No. I never had the chance to put it all on the line like that. I'm just glad there are guys like you willing to do it. I'm starting to think I'm crazy for doing this, risking my life and marriage out there. It would be a different matter if someone didn't care about the war. I'm thinking of going back to school. I was studying to be an electrical engineer when I joined the Army. If you decide to go to Purdue, let me know. I have some connections there, and it might help if you decide to apply. It can't hurt. I held out one of my business cards to him. I don't think we can be friends, Lester. I can't look at you without thinking about the fact that Kelly almost cheated on you. I appreciate you did, but I just can't. It's okay. I understand, but the offer still stands, even if we never meet again. I'll call if you ask. Some time passed while we drank our beers. John broke the silence. You're a different guy, Lester. You refuse to get into bed with a woman like Kelly. You sit there. Don't ask me about my time there. You wouldn't believe how many guys ask. Like it's something we want to talk about. I think it's your right to talk or not. I'm not going to take vicarious pleasure in listening to your war stories. He finished his beer, shook my hand, thanked me for the beer and everything else, and then walked out. I got one letter from Kelly. John Tyler was leaving the service. They were moving to Texas, where he planned to finish his degree at the University of Texas. They were also planning to get pregnant as soon as he graduated. The letter included another thank you from her. I wish them all the luck in the world. I hope they will be an example of how a person can give in to temptation, almost fall, learn from the experience, and ultimately create a strong marriage. Despite my history, I am a hopeless romantic. A month later, early one Sunday morning, someone knocked on my front door. I opened the door and was surprised to find Gwen's younger brother standing there looking over his shoulder. I saw her dad sitting in the car and my less dad, and I would like to talk. Well, Pete, you can come in, but your dad is as welcome in my house as I am in his. Tell him to stay in the car and you can come in. Pete got back in the car and spoke to my father. I couldn't hear what was said, but the body language spoke volumes. I held back from blowing the old bastard off. Pete came back alone. I let him in and poured him a cup of coffee. I always liked getting along with Pete. You've pissed Dad off more than a hornet. It's not going to be a pleasant drive home. I'm sorry, but if you ever gave me a slack, I'd do the same. Now that I'm no longer with your sister, I don't have to pretend. Why don't you tell me why you're here? This is Gwen. Dad and I came over yesterday to get her out of that creep. Brad's apartment. He hit her and gave her bruises. I'm sorry to hear that, but what does that have to do with me? We've been separated for a year and divorced for over 6 months. Dad and I were wondering if you could take her back. She cried all last night, kept saying she wanted to be your wife and made the biggest mistake of her life when she left you. I'm sorry to hear that she was hurt. Honestly, I don't wish that on anyone, especially someone I once loved. But there's no way I'm going back to Gwen again. I'll never be able to trust her. She broke my heart in two. Where is she now? At the Holiday Inn. She couldn't look you in the eye, but she didn't stop us when we said we were going to your place again. I apologize. I wish her luck in getting her somewhere safe, but it won't be here with me. I rose from the table and held out my hand, signaling that the conversation was over. Pete reached up and took my hand. There was sadness in his eyes. If anything, I can't blame you, but I had to try. My sister ruined everything, and you're a great guy and always treated her well. I don't know what got into her head to mess it up by Liz. I didn't walk Pete to the door. I didn't want to see their bastard father again. I heard the car start and pull out of the driveway. That was the last I heard of this family. Mutual friends informed me that Gwen had moved north and taken a job in Northbrook at Allstate in the year following my divorce from Gwen. I had many opportunities to lick my soul wounds, over a dozen 1- and 2-night dates. Most of these young ladies went home just as satisfied, if not more satisfied, than I did. Practice makes perfect. I met Grace at a concert on the ISU campus. No, not at a rock concert. It was a chamber orchestra from Chicago, and the highlight of the evening was variations on the theme of Folia by Salieri, Gemignani, and other Italian composers. Sitting next to me in the audience was a petite, pixie-like woman who reminded me of pictures of Twiggy, Patty Boyd, and other British fashion models. My father was a big fan of George Harrison and Eric Clapton. Grace struck up a conversation during the intermission asking if I enjoyed the concert. I learned that she was in grad school for graphic arts, played the cello, and was willing to let me buy her a drink after the concert. At a pub nearby, we had a drink while swapping stories. You'd think, given the name Grace, that she was born into a religious family. But that wasn't the case at all. Her parents named her after Grace Slick, lead singer of the band Jefferson Airplane. She grew up in what you might call a commune outside Carbondale. When I told her I lived on a farm, she looked extremely interested. "Do you have a garden?" "I'm surrounded by my landlord's cornfields. There's a plot of land, probably 40 by 40, that the previous tenant used to grow vegetables. But in the 5 years I've lived there, I've never planted anything. Now it's nothing but weeds there. That's too bad. Gardening can be a very relaxing, almost spiritual activity, not to mention how wonderful fresh food tastes." We moved on to other topics until it was time to leave. I walked her home, gave her a sweet kiss on the cheek at the door, and gave her my phone number. She was different from any other girl I had ever known. I called the next day and we made arrangements to attend a student art exhibit on campus the following weekend. It was a great week at work. I got a promotion and a nice raise. All the extra time I had put in since my marriage broke up had paid off. Saturday afternoon, I picked Grace up from her apartment. It was beautiful April day, and I was tempted to suggest spending it outdoors on the patio, drinking beer instead of sitting indoors looking at student papers. 30 minutes later, walking through the first gallery, I regretted not suggesting the pub, almost all of the works. Both paintings and sculptures seemed to exist only to shock. Grace held my hand and must have sensed my reaction when I approached a 3-panel triptych that could only be interpreted as Mary performing fellatio on each of the Holy Trinity genitals were not shown. But the artist's intent could not have been clearer if this piece of trash was considered art, and something Grace had anything to do with. Then our date would soon be over, with no chance of future encounters. I think I'd like to leave. Grace squeezed my hand. "Maybe we can decide after the next gallery. If you feel the same way, after that we can leave." Grace pulled me into the next room. I looked around almost reluctantly, but was pleasantly surprised by what I saw. It was art, at least from my perspective, instead of art meant to shock and offend. This was art that lifted the spirit or made one think, not just scandalize. We walked through the room, stopping at each exhibit and comparing thoughts until we came to a painting of 2 people, a woman and a man descending an open staircase. My gaze was drawn to their faces. What were they thinking about? Then I noticed the ring on the woman's left hand as she held on to the railing, and the man's ring finger was bare. I stared at this painting without looking away until I glanced at the card to read the title of the work and the artist's name. Oil on Canvas. Slow down, you up. Let me do this more, by Grace Powell. Adams. I looked at Grace. You did that. Grace looked at me with a smile. Yeah, I know, she smiled. Do you like it? It's fantastic. Is the title in French? What does it mean? The last day of lovers. Now their expressions make sense. It's over for them. Why? I can't decide. What do you think? I knew what I was thinking, but I wasn't ready to share. I'll tell you later. Did you use live models to other students? They stood on the stairs for hours posing. Let's go to the last gallery. I want to show you something else. On the wall of the last gallery hung the second of Grace's works. It was completely different from the first. It was an animated drawing of a giant aquarium filled with 100 different fish and sea creatures. My God! This is fantastic! My niece would just go crazy over something like this. You are so talented. Why is all this great work here in this crap in the first gallery? Grace laughed before answering. Most of us think the professor who curates the show is using its shock value to make a name for himself on the avant-garde in Chicago. We're pretty sure he's sleeping with at least one student, the guy who caused this Holy Trinity mess. I hope this doesn't come across as bitchy. On the contrary, it only confirms your good taste. I hope you won't mind. I can send a letter to the university suggesting at least a change of galleries. We finally made it to the pub and spent a few hours drinking, snacking, and learning more and more about each other. The more Grace told me, the more I marveled at how down-to-earth this young woman is, especially considering where she grew up. Grace told me everything straight. The evening was cooling down. It was time to get in less. Do you mind if we break early tonight? I have a project to finish that's due on Monday. I shouldn't even have spent all this day having fun, but I really wanted to spend time with you. I agreed, and what could I do or say? It was an amazing first date, and I didn't want to ruin it. Grace asked if we could have dinner the following weeknight. We agreed that she would come over to my place on Wednesday, and I would cook dinner. On Wednesday, Grace showed up at my house at 5:30. She was most interested in the weed bed that had once been a garden. There was a 7-foot-high fence around the perimeter to keep the deer out. Grace took a shovel from the garage and began digging along the fence. That's fantastic. They buried the fence to keep the rabbits out. Grace did the dishes, we ate stew and drank beer, and I learned more and more about her. By the time we finished dinner, we discussed my reaction to her painting of two lovers. Given how my marriage ended and Grace apologized. If the painting upset me, she filled in more blanks about herself in a little over a year. She would be getting her Master of Arts degree. She spoke Italian and French, played the cello, and was a skilled painter. Why don't you do? I don't know how to play sports. I'm a total klutz. I've tried tennis, softball, riding. What's the matter? If it takes skill, I'm no good at anything. I can run and swim. But in yoga class, I fall to the back row. I struggled not to laugh at that image. Grace laughed for the two of us. That's hard to believe. I mean, you must have the eye-hand coordination to play the cello and draw. I'm nervous. Don't even think about taking me out on the dance floor. I'm a total dummy. My legs and arms dangle. I can't paint if someone is watching me. I can only play the cello because I learned how to play in my room with no prying eyes. You didn't have a music teacher? My mom. Grace looked at the clock on the wall. I need to get back to town, but before I go, I have a huge favor to ask of you. I'd like to plant a garden in your backyard. I'll do all the work by the seeds. We do everything. I'll share what? Grow with you, and you can eat fresh produce. We discussed logistics parameters regarding my personal space, etc. And when she agreed to my demands, I agreed to her request. Of course, the thought of fresh produce was appealing, but what convinced me was the thought of Grace living with us for the next 6 months. For the next 2 weeks, Grace would call me at work, get my agreement to come over, and when she returned home, I would catch her working in our garden. One day she rented a rototiller. She was halfway to the plot when I pulled up. I asked if I could work on it. She showed me how it worked, and I was done. That Friday, a load of organic bovine manure was piled in front of the fence. All weekend, we took turns wheelbarrowing it and incorporating it into the soil, even though it was drizzling rain both days. When we were done, Grace surprised me with a hug and a kiss. I've missed this so much since I left home. It makes me so happy, digging in the dirt, smelling the earth, and it's even better when the sun comes out and you feel its warmth on your body. It was my first garden experience, but I understood what she meant. Over the years, I had watched my boss plow with his tractor and harvest corn, but I was removed from it all. Working on this small plot of land was a hands-on encounter with nature. We went into the house and made sandwiches for dinner. I sensed something was bothering Grace and waited for her to bring it up less. My lease ends in 3 weeks, right after graduation. My roommates are graduating. Could you let me rent a second bedroom? I'll pay the rent and share in the food and utilities. Grace's question saddened me. I had hoped to be more than just a friend to Grace. We met on an ad hoc basis with her studies, gardening, and my recent promotion. Free time was limited. Obviously, Grace saw me as a roommate friend. Not in a romantic sense, but I liked her. I really liked her. And if that's how we were going to spend our time together, I'd agree. Yes. We sat and discussed the details. Division of labor, how much she would contribute to the rent and groceries. I had to ask, what about guests? She looked at me cheerfully. What do you mean by guests? Well, if one of us brings home an overnight guest, how does that work? I've never had roommates except for my ex-wife, so the subject has never come up before. How do you and your roommates deal with this problem now? It looked like Grace was about to cry. We ask all guests to be respectful of other neighbors. It's never been a problem. I decided to drop the subject. I suppose you and I can work it out if it ever comes up. Shortly after that, Grace left. She said she would be back the following weekend to begin planting. Saturday morning was warm and sunny, a perfect spring day. I had some things to do at the office, so I decided to bike the 10 miles into town before I left. I left a note on the kitchen table for Grace, letting her know I'd be home by 4 and asking if we could have dinner together. I turned on the computer. Nothing. Then it struck me. It was doing an upgrade this weekend and I had completely forgotten. It actually made me happy. Not all was lost. I'd had a great morning walk and would get a second one on the way home, and best of all, I'd get to spend a sunny afternoon in the garden with Grace. I closed the terminal and walked out whistling a happy tune as I drove home. Funny enough, the gate in front of the house was closed and Grace's car was parked inside the gate. The garden is behind the house and you can't see it from the road. I hung my bike on my shoulder and walked through the gap between the gates. Once past the house, I peered into the garden. There she stood, working with a hoe. Grace shouted, "Who's there? Stop! I'm in love with you!" Grace looked surprised. "Really?" "Yes, really. I want to be your friend. But most of all, I want to be your lover." "Then why didn't you say that before?" "Because I'm stupid. I didn't know how to tell my friend Grace that I wanted to be more than a friend. I didn't want to lose your friendship if that's all I could be. And I thought the same thing about you. Why would you think that? You're gorgeous." "Yeah, right. I saw the way you were looking at Janice." "Who's Janice?" "My painting. And one night I was looking at your photo album in your room. You have some pictures of Gwen in there. Look, I won't kid you. Gwen looks good, but you look great." "Okay, I believe you. What now? Should we hold off on boarding for now?" After that, we went to the bedroom. One more thing. It never occurred to me to let Brad get away with seducing my wife, even though Gwen was equally responsible for the destruction of our marriage. But he deserved payback for his blatant disregard for our vows and subsequent pressure on my naive wife to financially ruin me in the divorce. However, I was never in a hurry for revenge, and now that my relationship with Grace was progressing, was it still important? Damn right it was. I certainly could have jumped him with a baseball bat and beat the shit out of him, but I had no desire to end up in jail. People like me wouldn't last long in that kind of environment. But in today's online world, it's so easy to spy on people. After my divorce from Gwen, I'd spend an hour each week using search engines, Facebook, and other portals that allowed me to keep myself safely ensconced in Brad's world. Using an alias, I kept a low profile doing nothing malicious, waiting for the right circumstances to act. I've heard the phrase, "revenge is a dish best served cold." Is it true? In my case, it certainly was. It was 2 years after my divorce when the perfect opportunity presented itself. By then, Brad was working in the IT department of a well-respected conservative brokerage firm and was engaged to another woman. I decided to save his innocent bride the hassle of divorcing his ass. It was best to do it before the wedding. A few weeks before Brad's wedding to this beautiful young woman, it was time to strike. It cost me $4,000, but it was worth it. Nothing in Brad's life was a secret. Every Wednesday, a few guys from Brad's office spent the evening drinking at the bar of a local hotel. It was a typical boys' night out. Most of the guys left after an hour or two, but usually 1 or 2 single guys, including Brad, stayed until 8 or 9. The Chicago call girl. It didn't take much effort to get him into her room. She caught Brad's eye as she sat at the bar. He said goodbye to the only remaining coworker and asked Lacey if he could buy her a drink. She said yes, and for the next 15 minutes allowed herself to be seduced by Brad's smooth speech at her suggestion. They bought another round, and Brad agreed when Lacey suggested they finish their drinks in her room. 2 small, hidden cameras were set up in the room. Lacey introduced Brad to Philip, her coworker. Who knows why Brad decided to get involved? The next day, Lacey and I watched both videos. We agreed that I could only use screenshots, and neither her nor Philip's faces should be on them. I pondered whether I should let Brad know that I was the one who had set him up. In the end, I didn't. Call me a coward, but I didn't want the revenge series to escalate. Now I had a lot to lose, given my relationship with Grace. Anyway, my revenge was complete. Brad was out of town, tail tucked. It would be a long time before the pictures posted anonymously on the internet would disappear. I guess I should tell you about how things worked out for Grace and me for the next 15 months. We lived together and loved each other in that farmhouse up to that point. I had been the happiest I'd ever been in my life. Grace taught me a lot, making me read great books and broadening my horizons. I met her parents at the commune that first 4th of July. Once again, I wasn't prepared for how they surprised me that weekend. Who would have thought their community would bless me with the most wonderful Independence Day celebration I had experienced so far? We were sitting on the back porch drinking beer before dinner. Les. I got a job offer today. Judging by the tone of your voice, I'm not going to like it, am I? I've been offered to work on an animated movie. It's a company called Enlightenment, headquartered in France. They're making a new animated movie based on Dickens' Christmas Tale, A Christmas Carol. I will have to move to Paris for almost a year during development. I knew Grace had few opportunities in central Illinois, but Paris. I needed to put on my big boy pants, but it wasn't easy. Wow, that sounds like a great opportunity. I guess I'm surprised, though. I didn't realize you were applying for jobs outside of the States. I didn't. It was thanks to a friend of a friend of a friend who's already there. One of my professors sent samples of my work to a few people. It spread, and they called me today. I thought you were talking about freelancing to stay here. Freelancing is hard, if you don't have any credentials. This will assist me get those papers when I come back. Or you might find Paris more interesting than Peoria and Bloomington. How are you going to keep them on the farm? You know? I've been thinking about that, baby. You always claimed you felt I was fairly reasonable. You know how much I love the farm, and you must know how much I adore you. When do you have to give them an answer? Before the end of the week? Well, you know me. I'm not going to say no, and I'll back you 100%. Give me 2 days to heal, and then I'll tell you it's okay. And you can offer them your answer. Grace came up from the chaise couch, sitting on my lap, her arms wrapped around my neck and her lips snuggled against mine. I'm going to miss her. I debated if I should inform Grace about her graduation present. The diamond ring was in my gun safe. 2 days later, when I told Grace to affirm her acceptance with lighting, I didn't bother telling her about the ring. Grace. The day after graduation, I did my best to be a cowboy, but it wasn't easy. I don't think I fooled anybody. But I think Grace appreciated my ability to remain composed. Grace left her car and most of her belongings, including her painting supplies, at my place. Grace's mother held me hard and murmured into my ear, "She loves you. Trust her." I took her to O'Hare and kissed her farewell. God, I despise that darn airport. Ever since Gwen abandoned me there all those years ago, and now I am doing it again. Only this time my darling is flying away, and I am staying. We exchanged letters, photos, and emails, Skyped at least once a week, and discussed how I wanted to spend my next holiday in Paris. None of this helped as I fell into depression. The majority of the crops in the garden we planted together that year would rot in the field. One afternoon, a couple of my co-workers arrived to our house and, seeing the state of the garden, requested if they may harvest it. I didn't care and promised them everything will be okay. Debbie King worked as an administrative assistant in our department. Debbie was a widow with 2 boys after losing her spouse to a severe type of hepatitis. On Saturday, she and her 2 sons came to our house and spent several hours harvesting. "What will you do with all of those vegetables?" I asked. Asked me. My neighbor is going to educate me about canning. I need to get some canning jars and prepare meals for the winter. Tell you what, I have at least 3 dozen jars you can take. Just promise me that if we need them next year, you will bring them back. And why wouldn't you need them? You never know. Grace performed the canning. I just poured the beer while she did the work. Debbie stared at me. "She loves you less. She will be back." I turned around and walked back inside, mumbling to myself. I hope so. Debbie left shortly after with her boys. A few boxes of crops and 40 canning jars. Grace expected to have 10 days off between Christmas and New Year's weekend and intended to fly home during that period. So we determined that early November would be an ideal time for me to fly to Paris. Grace would have to work throughout the week, but we would have the evenings and 2 weekends to spend together. I boarded the plane for the direct journey to Paris, hoping my jinx at O'Hare was over. Grace stood outside de Gaulle Customs waiting for me. The next morning I awoke and took a moment to get my bearings. After collecting my breath, I discovered a kitchen, a table with a tiny refrigerator underneath and a burner on top. Grace had left instructions for how to use the coffee pot. Half a baguette was on the chopping board and jam was in the fridge. I bathed, shaved, and dressed. There was a key hanging on the door. I chose to spend some time roaming about the neighborhood. At 4 p.m. I was back in the flat, reading the book I had brought with me when Grace stormed in. That is it. For the next 64 hours, you will not be out of my sight. That is all right with me. We don't even need to leave this room. Have you seen how the refrigerator in my dollhouse is set up? We are going to starve to death. Isn't there delivery in Paris? Is there a Domino's here? I was kidding, of course, this was Paris. I do not know, but nobody eats here till 7 o'clock. Make love to me, and then we will go to dinner. Grace was changing into her work attire at this point. I couldn't argue against her logic. We spent Saturday at the Musée d'Orsay and had a wonderful lunch just around the corner from Notre Dame. Several of Grace's co-workers wanted to meet with me, but she declined on Friday because she wanted us to have a nice evening alone, but agreed to meet them Saturday night. When Grace and I went into the restaurant that evening, there were already a dozen individuals sitting at a big table in the back of the dining area. Grace looked to be popular among her co-workers. It's hardly surprising that many of them wanted to meet the man who had her heart. After introductions, handshakes with males, and air kisses with women, we were seated in small groups. Me and an English woman, Holly. Megumi is a Japanese woman, and a Frenchman, Claude. Megumi and Claude spoke superb English. I had more trouble understanding Holly than either of them. Grace would occasionally flip between the other two groups, both of whom spoke French. A server took our drink orders. Various dishes of appetizers emerged and went. Holly and I had a nice debate about who was responsible for the best rock and roll, the Americans or the Brits. Claude agreed with Holly, claiming that Exile on Main Street by the Stones, recorded in France, was the greatest rock album of all time. Megumi was on my side, having grown up hearing her mother's Cheap Trick vinyl record live at Budokan. Mom was in the audience and expressed her belief that Elvis and Chuck Berry started it all. It was a lot of fun. Nobody took it seriously. At one point, I had to ask Grace Baby who is the greatest rock singer of all time. Grace didn't miss a beat in naming not only the finest woman, but also the greatest singer, male or female. Miss Slick from Music brought up the topic of sports, specifically soccer versus soccer. Grace abruptly raised her voice and began berating one of the Frenchmen in French. In our year together, I had never seen Grace so enraged. I did not comprehend a word. Everyone else was speaking French and staring in awe. Even the adjoining table paused to listen. After a whole minute, Grace apologized to her colleagues. Even I understood. "Pardon?" and announced our departure as we left the eatery. I asked, "What was that?" Jean-Paul is one of those French bastards who can't stop himself from insulting Americans. In my experience, people like him are in the minority. He knew you didn't know French and used the chance to say some terrible things to Renee about American guys, specifically you. I overheard him and wouldn't allow him get away with it. I hope you don't mind if I defend your honor. Not at all. But why did we need to leave? Renee is such a shithead. She knew I couldn't tolerate Jean-Paul, but she invited him regardless. I will not lie to you. Jean-Paul is a weasel. He attempted to get me to go out with him. I told him no. We are in a serious relationship, and I will not break my pledge to you. We're still in a relationship, right? Yes, that is good. I was afraid to bring it up while we were separated. I couldn't take it if you started long-distance dating. I have not changed my mind. I'll still be around when you get home. I love you much less. Please never crush my heart. Before I went, we had another meeting with her colleagues, this time without Jean, Paul, or Renee. Claude made sure I understood that not all French people share Jean-Paul's anti-American views. The evening was enjoyable and free of drama. Paris revived my faith that Grace and I would have a future. The next 5 months were extremely long, made all the more so by the cold, long winter on the prairie. Grace's visit during the vacations contributed to the promise of spring, which brought better weather and longer daylight hours, albeit Grace's return was still months away. I had intended to spend a week in Paris in March, but Grace stated her work hours were absurd right now because it was a busy time to get the movie ready for the holiday release. The first draft of the visuals needed to be completed by mid-May. I canceled my travel arrangements. With any luck, Grace would be home by mid-June. It was the 10th of May, a wonderful day. The temperature hovered about 70 degrees. The sun shone after 3 days of rain. I drove home from work planning to sip a beer on the back porch. I'm not sure why. Perhaps it was simply because I felt closer to Grace in that way. However, I had spent the previous Saturday with a rental road and a tiller in the garden. Perhaps I will plant some tomatoes and string beans. Simple things. Meanwhile, I'll have a beer and have a look at what was now Grace's place. I pulled up to the house and was astonished to see the gate closed. Instead of opening the gate and driving through, I parked and walked to the back of the home. The most gorgeous garden nymph stood there in the garden, resting against a hoe and staring directly at me. We stood there for perhaps half a minute, simply looking at each other until she dropped the hoe and pushed herself into my arms. "Why are you here?" I asked. "We concluded early 3 days ago. They just require half the team for tweaking, fine-tuning, and post-production. They requested for the volunteers to be released. So I volunteered, packed my bags, took the first flight to O'Hare, hopped on a bus, and arrived home 2 hours ago. I hope everything is okay. I wanted to surprise you. I hope you don't have plans. Damn, this woman can be quite stupid at times. It's time to put her straight. Yes, I have plans. Wait a minute." Grace was still holding me securely. I broke free from her hold, dashed into the house, and opened the safe. I opened the box and bent down on one knee. "Will you marry me, Grace?" As I have stated, she is capable of being really foolish. I completely astonished her with my proposal. It took her too long to discover her voice, but when she did, she used the correct words. "Yes." "Thomas Lester, I love you very much. Is not Sunday too early? It will give us time to obtain our license, and for our folks to arrive on Sunday. We got married in the garden wherever we could. It was a little muddy, but the 20 or so guests, including both parents, siblings, and a few others, didn't mind. Grace wore a dress despite the fact that it was a backyard wedding. I am sure my folks appreciated that." Epilogue. Grace and I lived in the farmhouse until the end of harvest. We spent the summer hunting for a home of our own. We located the ideal location a few miles north of town, about a quarter mile from the river. We were far enough away from the water to not be concerned about flooding. It's 4 acres of land, 2 of which are wooded, with enough flat land to plant another garden for elegance. The property has a 2-car house and a garage that is larger than the trailer. We will convert the south side garage into a studio for Grace, with enough space for both cars. We will sell the 2-car house as soon as it is completed. The builder dug the foundation and poured the basement walls, but the weather has turned bad, so they will have to wait until spring to start building again. Grace undertakes freelancing work but primarily focuses on painting. She's very good. For example, the picture La Dernière appeared in mid-December and sold for $8,000, so between gardening, freelancing, and painting. Grace is a busy yet cheerful lady. It also allows her to be a stay-at-home mom. Grace and I are expecting our first child in May. She wants 3 or 4, so we decided not to wait. Yeah, I am a lucky son of a bitch. I have a wonderful, loving wife, a good-paying career that I adore, a baby is on the way, and a gorgeous plot of land to share with my pixie wife. Thank you for taking time to hear today's story. If you loved the story, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you have a tale to share regarding your own or someone else's circumstance, please do not hesitate to contact me. Take care.